Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back to Potomac Watch, chatting now about a bill moving through the House of Representatives this week that would essentially force a divestment of TikTok, the social media app, from its Chinese owners. The bill passed through the relevant House committee by an overwhelming margin and looks likely to pass the House. Alicia, you've been following this story a long time because there have been efforts to force a breakup of TikTok from its owner, ByteDance, for years now, but Trump's effort, for instance, couldn't hold up in court. What do you make of this latest effort, both on the merits on how much of a threat is TikTok to our national security? And is this effort, do you think, more worthy and more likely to succeed than past attempts?
Well, on the first question, I think is without doubt that TikTok presents a real and clear threat to Americans. And many who use TikTok, primarily the younger generation, just are completely oblivious to it. I saw some surveys show that younger Americans use the app for almost 6 hours every day. It's mind-boggling. And the threat isn't just that they're consuming these silly videos or some that are actually more dangerous and send them down rabbit holes on eating disorders or self-harm and can cause suicides. All of that's been documented. I think the bigger danger is that this app is collecting all sorts of data, location data, browsing data, search data about the users and their friends. And it's not just using this data for political targeting. We don't know to the extent that what it is doing with this data. We know that it's going back to China, where the ByteDance, which is TikTok's corporate parent, is using the data to train its algorithms, but we don't know exactly what else it's doing with this data. And we know that the Chinese government, the CCP, has a very extensive surveillance operation and cyber espionage operation that's been trying to infiltrate U.S. systems through various means. The Office of Personnel, a lot of federal workers last decade had their emails and their personal information hacked by China. And so they're basically building this massive repertoire of information on Americans that they can use in various ways. And again, that's a danger. But the other danger is that they're also trying to create this kind of political influence operation. And we saw and we heard about how the Russians tried to kind of use social media operations in 2016, especially in order to sow discord. They kind of promoted Bernie Sanders. They promoted Donald Trump. They basically just tried to wreak havoc in American politics and turn people against each other. And then to some extent they were successful, though there are obviously a lot of other influences. We don't know what the Chinese are doing. I think the Chinese, we have information that they are actively censoring. ByteDance has censored or suppressed information that is kind of particularly sensitive to the CCP. In Tiananmen Square massacre, the Hong Kong protests, the information about Tibet. But we don't also know to what extent it's amplifying kind of divisive topics. I mean, again, there was a study by the Network for Contagion Research Institute that kind of looked at the disparity between hashtags on Instagram and TikTok and found a lot of the hashtags that were more divisive in American politics, like pro-Hamas, occurred like 20 times more, fold more on TikTok than it did on Instagram. And the question is, well, why is that? It's probably because the algorithms are amplifying it. Last fall, Osama bin Laden's 2002 letter to America, which was just full of anti-Semitic tropes and basically conspiracy theories about the U.S. such as it created HIV, went viral on TikTok. And these videos racked up nearly 15 million views. And eventually, when it drew an uproar and started to, draw attention from Congress, TikTok took it down, though it said that, well, nothing in our algorithm, we didn't do anything for this video to go viral. And I think members of Congress are growing increasingly skeptical of the company's denials. It's starting to come off as a little bit of gaslighting.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right to reduce the risks to, one, espionage and data collection, and two, that broader point about influence. You don't have to think hard to come up to an examples where this could be a real problem in our politics. One that is always given to me is, imagine there is a crisis in the Taiwan Strait and that the Chinese Communist Party has decided to take military action there, as we have been worried about for a long time. And there was an ability for the CCP to kind of promote certain messages about what was going on there and have a profound influence on what Americans think about that issue, would maybe try to tell them to shut down efforts in Congress for the U.S. to intervene in what's going on in the Pacific. I mean, so there are some real scenarios about how that influence might be used that should give everyone some pause, I think. Vinay, a lot of folks who are against the TikTok divestment bill, it has some strange political bedfellows. I mean, there are Republicans who are against it. Trump has suggested he's against it, though his views are a little bit murky. You have Rand Paul in the Senate who is against it. And one argument that's being made is that it's a First Amendment issue. It's a matter of free expression. I don't think that holds a lot of water, given we're talking about the problem being the owner of the platform, not the messages that Americans are putting out or their freedom to do so. But I'm curious what you make of those First Amendment claims and whether you think they would have any standing in court, since inevitably this is heading to litigation if it passes.
I do think that looking at TikTok and the possibility of banning it on the surface, there are First Amendment questions that automatically jump to mind, but I also agree with you that the authors of the bill took those into account. The most relevant precedent that a lot of the critics have pointed to is Lamont versus Postmaster General from 1965, which was a case involving the ability of communist organizations from overseas to distribute their materials through U.S. mail to American citizens. Congress tried to regulate that, and then the Supreme Court found that there is a right to receive information from foreign adversaries, even outright false or propagandistic information. And so there are First Amendment protections for the dissemination of materials, even from foreign adversaries. And I think most Americans who are free speech minded would agree that the government shouldn't be in the business of outright regulating the dissemination of the information itself. But as you mentioned, the bill is targeted towards TikTok as the parent company and its ownership of the broadcast medium. So the idea is not necessarily that you are going to curb directly the types of messages that are allowed to be broadcast over TikTok, but the idea is that that might take place if the ownership were to change hands to a U.S.-based separate entity, or if it were to be sold, then we wouldn't have the Chinese Communist Party being able to directly influence that distribution of propaganda through the medium. And so it's a distinction in terms of what is the corporate structure rather than directly banning the content itself. But I do think that the Senate is currently trying to tighten up some of that language. Hopefully they'll be able to do it in a way that doesn't gut or weaken what the bill is aiming to do. I'm worried about the potential that a lawsuit would be able to unwind it. And so hopefully there are some critics who outright don't want to do it, and they probably are unpersuadable. But I think that there are a lot of people, particularly in the Senate, who are on the fence and have some legitimate concerns who they want to see addressed in an updated version of the bill. And hopefully they're able to reach a compromise that would still allow the substantive aims of the bill to be addressed.
Well, Vinay, we'll let you have the last word, but we'll be watching closely to see how this TikTok bill plays out. Thank you both for joining me, and we'll be here tomorrow again with more Potomac Watch.